My name is Charles D. Fairbanks. I'm known as Don. I was a World War II veteran. I was in the 8th Air Force as a tail gunner on B-24s. I grew up right here in Cincinnati. I was born in Toledo, Ohio. My dad moved to work in the oil fields in Oklahoma. And when I was 4 years old, no, less than that, about 3 years old, we moved to Cincinnati. And that's where I grew up. I was down at Lunken Airport, which is a local airport here, walking around, and a couple of flight instructors, one of them kind of hanging and says, "Hey, the Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor." The guy said, "Where in the hell is Pearl Harbor?" That's what we knew about history. I was in high school at the time. I was a senior in high school. About 2 weeks before graduation, 4 of us went down to enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps. I was the only one old enough by about 2 or 3 months, so I signed up. I was called up in mid-1942, and of course, like everybody else, I signed up for pilot training. I get on my first physical. I have a slight deafness in one ear, so they wouldn't pass me. They said, take these tests and we'll decide what we're going to do. So I took 3 tests for gunnery, armament rather, maintenance, and communications. And they said I did well on all three of them, so I could pick any one I wanted, so I took aircraft maintenance. They sent me to Keesler Field down in Biloxi, Mississippi to become a mechanic on a B-24. And when we graduated, they said, would you like to become a gunner? So I took the very same physical I failed, passed it, no problems. Went through gunnery school at Laredo, Texas. Well, when I first went into service, everything was so new. You know, here was just a kid who grew up on a little farm and hadn't been anywhere. So we're in different cities, meeting a lot of different people, doing something all the time, so you don't really have time to do much of anything except do what they have you doing, whether it's marching or learning or whatever. They started us off originally with BB guns that fired a stream of BBs, and they had moving model airplanes in the background, and we just shot at those. We're generally in ground school 2/3 of the time versus being on the range the final third of the time. They're teaching us how to lead and lag, and one thing that they told us, it seems a little unusual, but if you're flying in a bomber, shooting the guns out the side, firing on one side of the bomber due to the slipstream against the side of the bullet will climb. The other side has a tendency to rotate downwards. There's a procedure in gunnery, and one of the simplest was you just aim the gun at the airplane and count 1, 2, 3 and see where the airplane is. Then you lead the airplane by that much, which is a simple way of doing it. The gun generally fired not all in a straight line. They were a pattern, and it would scatter them quite a bit. We generally zeroed the guns in at 1,000 yards. The guns we really were trained on was the 50 caliber, since that's what we're going to fly in combat. We also did handguns. We did automatic 45, which we carried. We had some rifle shooting, very minimal, but mostly just a Colt 45 and the 50 caliber machine gun. Well, it's like shooting skeet. When you shoot, we did that on the range too. When you shoot skeet, you don't generally aim. You just reflex and shoot at it. So shooting the gun out of a bomber is about the same way. It's a reflex, a guess. The first flying was done in the back of a T-6, shooting at targets towed by another T-6. Then we moved up to twin Beaches that had a turret on them. And from that, we went into either a Hudson or sometimes a Martin B-26. After graduation, I went up into Idaho, where they put me on a crew. It's the first time I met the crew. From there, we went to Casper, Wyoming for our crew training. There were 10 on a flight crew, the pilot, the co-pilot, a bombardier, and a navigator. Then at that time, I was a ball turret gunner. We had a tail gunner, 2 waist gunners, a radio operator, and a flight engineer were enlisted. We were there for about 4 4 months, I believe it was. And then normally, when you go through flight training like that, you stay on a crew and you're assigned to an outfit somewhere, sometimes in the States, sometimes they put you on a boat and take you to whatever theater you're going to, and they put you in a crew when you get there. Our crew is sort of unusual. We didn't realize this at the time, but 3 crews of us that went through training together, we went on a little furlough and we came back to, instead of going to Casper, they told us to go to Topeka, Kansas. So our 3 crews show up at Topeka, Kansas, and they put us on, the crew is 10 men. It took 5 men, put on one B-17, and 5 men put on another B-17. They did that with all 3 crews, and we flew. Air Transport Command was flying the B-17s. We flew as passengers all the way over to England, which was very unusual. Generally went over in a B-24 if that's what you're trained in, or you took the other passengers on a boat. So what had happened, and we hadn't realized at the time, evidently the pilots had volunteered us for a special operation. The operation was a very early operation set up by what is now the CIA. It was called OSS at that time. And it was started very early in World War II, and we were very early in World War II. The thing that surprised us, we get to England, and they take us to the base we're going to operate off of. And the first thing is, the commanding officer got all 6 crews in there, and he said, we're a very secret operation. If we catch you talking to anybody that we don't recognize, you're subject to being shot. That gets your attention when you're only 18 years old. Roosevelt got the idea of OSS. And we had a general from World War I, Wild Bill Donovan. He's very famous in World War I. They put him in charge of OSS. The British had been doing this sort of thing. And they were in the war quite a long time before we were. They had a base up in Canada where they're training people for spies and sabotage, things like this. I understand Wild Bill Donovan went over and spent some time to see how they worked and so forth. And one of the problems he had with setting up this outfit like we had was we needed bombers. And Hap Arnold did not want to release any bombers at all because he wanted bombers for bombing. Well, one of the things that knocked the submarines out of the business is airplanes. And they were B-24s. The British had a couple airplanes they were using. They didn't have the same range the B-24 had, so they started using B-24s for anti-sub patrol. The British operated them, we operated them, everything else. The airplanes had a lot of the equipment taken out of them for bombing because they were low altitude. And that other equipment put in because they're trying to find submarines. Anyhow, when our outfit started coming up, the submarine war started to come to a halt because of basically aircraft. So they had these extra anti-sub airplanes. So that's where we started. We had anti-sub airplanes been sent to a modification depot, and what we didn't need there they took out, and what we needed in ours they put in. But in ours they took the oxygen equipment out, they took all the armor plate off of it to get rid of weight. I mentioned they put flame suppressors on the guns and on the engines. They painted them all black. The nose on a B-24 sort of came out. Some of them had a turret in the nose. Our nose was modified where they made a bubble. It was like this, where they could stand out and look out. Both of them could look out the nose of the airplane because that's what they were doing. We didn't need a gun up there. We only had 2 guns on the airplane, top turret and tail turret. Since we're flying low, not going to be anybody below us trying to get under us. One of the things that it's hard to realize, I don't know where, maybe if you went to Alaska or up in Canada somewhere you could do this, but we do not have any place where there's no light, man-given light, like this, at night. We flew over there was no light at night anywhere. All the cities are blacked out and everything. You get fantastic night vision. It's amazing what you can see at night. Our operations were at night, and since we had to have ground contact so we could see the drop zone the people were working with, we only flew when the moon was brightest. A week before the bright moon to a week after the bright moon. After that, we didn't have enough light to see the ground or navigate. What we actually ended up doing was flying these B-24s, are all painted black, all black, flat black. They're real dull black, but later on they start painting them shiny black. They said when they're shiny black, when a searchlight hits the airplane, it doesn't show up like it does on the matte, flat black. They had suppressors on the guns and suppressors on the exhaust of the engine where you couldn't see them in flight. We were dropping supplies, like we're like the early Federal Express. People on the ground would want some specific material like guns, ammunition, supplies for medicine, this sort of thing. We'd fly at night and drop in a specific area. The area that we dropped in was about as big as 2, maybe 3 football fields. We'd come over the ground about 400 feet off the ground and drop our supplies in that small area. The area was marked by 3 people on the ground with flashlights. 2 of them were lined up at probably several hundred yards apart, lined up with the wind. And on the upwind end of the pattern, a guy was standing with a flashlight, and he would give us a code which changed every 2 hours. Where the ball turret was, they had put a liner around the inside where it went through the floor and through the bottom of the fuselage, and that was where people went out. We carried people. When we dropped them, we dropped them from about 500, 600 feet. But they went out. They had a static line on a parachute also, and they'd make maybe two or three swings before they hit the ground. And they were very special agents. They were trained to do a specific job, or they were trained to meet up with a specific underground unit and bring them money or special equipment that they needed for that operation. A lot of them were radio men, so they could communicate back and forth with London on special frequencies. Like I mentioned before, everything was super, super secret. We would not see these people we took to drop till we're in the airplane ready to go, and they'll come out and they put them in the airplane real quick, and the only person that got to see them is the person in the back of the airplane. We call him a dispatcher. He's the one that opened the door so the fellow get out the bottom. He's the one who threw the packages out and that sort of thing. The hole in the floor where the ball turret had been, we had a door over it. It has to open up the door. Then the person's going to jump. Now, whether it's a man or woman, they're all dressed up in jumpsuits. They have some of them had shoes on over the regular shoes that had double soles in them with springs between the soles to take up some of the shock hitting the ground. Underneath their jumpsuit, they had their clothes that they would wear. They'd land on the ground, get rid of the jumpsuit, and they'd look like any other Frenchman to walk about the way they were dressed. They carried special equipment with them that went out generally through the jaw hole when they went out. It could be special guns, be explosives, any type of thing they need for whatever they're going to do. They would use a sextant to line up certain stars to see what their position was, to tell what our geographical position was. The flights, the regular bombers, they were flying up around 25,000 feet. We generally flew 1,000, 2,000 feet off the ground. We're trying to stay below people finding out who we are. Radar was very, very new at that time. Some radar would pick us up, some would not, but we stayed low. We're generally running about 200, 250 mile an hour over the ground. So navigation was done by the pilot, navigation was done by the navigator and the bombardier. The navigator had a chart he was looking at. The bombardier was looking out the bubble on the front of the airplane, describing what he was seeing on the ground, cities, rivers, lakes, things like this. And the navigator was locating him on the chart to get us where we're going to go. Now, since this was very classified, we did not fly directly to our target. The navigator had to lay out a devious route to get there so that people were not really going where we're headed. The reason we used the B-24, it was faster than the B-17. It would carry more equipment. We had 2 bomb bays. B-17 had 1 bomb bay. So we could put 12 of these containers in our bomb bay. The B-17 can only put about 6. And the other thing was we had extremely long range compared to the B-17, so we could make long trips without having to land and refuel. Well, we had specific drop zones. We had 30 total missions we flew on. 24 of them were in France, 6 of them were in Belgium. So, in fact, D-Day, we flew a trip to Belgium. And the reason we did that is they were trying to keep all the aircraft away from Normandy, so they sent us to Belgium, which kept us out of that way. All the airplanes in the 8th Air Force were going to Normandy. And they started early in the morning. Flew all through the day and next couple of days. So they didn't want to get us mixed up with airplanes that we weren't supposed to be with. It was a mission. We went to Belgium, we dropped in Belgium. In fact, a fellow I met later lived in Belgium, and he was one of them that we dropped to on one of the missions to Belgium. He sent me maps, a bunch of diagrams and so forth of our drop zone. There were 3 airplanes at different times made drops in this specific zone. We had a convention or reunion, whatever you call it, in England and France. We went to England for about 4 days, then we went to France for 4 days. And when we went to France, we went to Lyon, which is way south of Paris, but it's the 2nd largest city in France. But it's in an area where there's a lot of farms and mountains and things like this where we could drop without being noticed. Most of the enemy, the Germans, were up around Paris and northern France, western France, eastern France. They had detachments way down in our area, but they're far apart, and they had a hard time getting to specific areas. So we dropped in very mountainous area. In fact, of the airplanes we had 80 total. We lost 43 of them. The majority of them were airplanes that flew into the top of a hill because we're always flying at low altitude. So a couple of them were shot down by people who had the enemy had brought guns in on the target area. Somebody had been caught, been forced to talk, and they knew these drop areas were certain spots, and the Germans were there. In fact, one drop zone we made is on top of a hill, small mountain. And it had a big monument up on top of this hill. And the monument was the French underground people had come to the site to pick up the supplies. Now, we're not the only one dropped on this site, but anyhow, came to pick up the supplies, and the Germans had found out about this drop zone, and they were hidden in the woods around the big field. And when the drop was made, they executed everybody in the drop zone, plus their families. Very, very brutal war. One mission we went on, the navigator made a 7-degree correction in the wrong direction. We normally flew up somewhere west of Paris and crossed the English Channel, south of England. There are 2 little islands just north of France, Jersey and Guernsey, which were checkpoints. He made this 14-degree error, so we came out over the Bay of Biscay, which is on the west side of France. There's 2 islands out there. He thought there was Jersey and Guernsey, so he made a turn, and we came up over the Brest Peninsula. That's an extension out the west of France, and that's where the submarine pens were located. So it's very heavily fortified. So we came up over the land, and being the tail, I see him starting to shoot at us. Now, getting shot at night is like, say 4th of July. Some of the rounds are red, they're yellow, they're blue, they're different colors. And when they shoot at you, if they're not very close, they just float up like a small balloon. But if they get close, then they start speeding up dramatically. Well, anyhow, I reported we're getting shot at. And at first, they're back pretty far, and then they started flying right over the top of the airplane. So the pilot made a turn, went back out over the Bay of Biscay, south of the Brest Peninsula. He had the radio man contact England in code to get our position. They contacted it. London told us where we were, and the navigator didn't believe it. He thought the Germans probably had broken our code and were trying to trap us. So he had him challenge it. Challenge came back correct, so we flew west out around the Brest Peninsula up into England. When we got back to England, we had to land the very first base we could find, which was way down in the southwest tip of England, a place called Exeter. It was a Spitfire base, which is a fighter didn't require big runways like we did, but we had to land there. They gassed us up, and we went on back up home. Total time on the mission was like 13 hours. We, nor the British, had radar. It's just very, very infantile. Since we flew at a low altitude and we're all black, it's hard to see us. One night, being a tail gunner, the moon was up at about 2 o'clock position. It was a beautiful clear night, and a German airplane, an Me-110, which is a twin-engine fighter, flew right behind us. He's about, maybe 30, 40 feet above us, and not more than a couple hundred feet behind us. He just floated right on by. The 110 has a long canopy on top of the fuselage. I could see the pilot and the fellow in the back seat. They just flew right on by, and evidently they may have had radar and they got close to us, but they couldn't see us. We never saw him again. One other night we're going in. We're into France about, maybe 100 miles. And all at once, I'd flown over this little town, and we're about, maybe 3 or 4 miles away from the town. A lot of gunfire came up in this little town. I mean, just a lot of it all at once. And it hit an airplane. It was at the same altitude we were, which is maybe 2,000 feet at the time. The airplane blew up, caught fire, and just before it hit the ground, it was all burned up. We thought it might be one of our airplanes because we're the only ones that fly that way. But the British do the same thing, so it had to be British because we didn't lose an airplane that night. But that gets your attention too. You see all this fire. We just flew over the same town. They figured that they tracked us to get proper altitude and deflection and so forth. And the other airplane just happened to be flying over the same town. He got it. Our airplane was hit once by one 20-millimeter shot from the ground. It hit our number 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right side. We didn't even know that. We're coming back from our drop zone. We're on top of a small overcast, and we started losing oil pressure on this one engine. So they shut the engine down, flew back and landed. We didn't even know what happened. We just thought low oil pressure. And the next day, the mechanic came in and said they found a 20-millimeter slug right through the bottom of the engine. That engine is about, the center of the engine is about 10 feet from the center of the airplane. So it could hit one of us just as easy. One time on takeoff, we brought the landing gear up, but the nose gear didn't retract. So they put the main gear down to see if it, when they put the main gear down, the nose wheel came up. So they brought the main gear up again, and the nose wheel went down. So we went back to the airport, and we put the landing gear down, and they had to force the nose gear to get it down so we have all 3 wheels when it touched. And the pilot might have been going a little bit too fast, but when we reached the end of the runway, he turned, and when he turned, the gear on the left side of the airplane folded, just bent underneath. There's no fire or anything like that, just rather minor damage to the airplane. It got the one wing where it hit the ground and where the propeller on that side hit the ground. But other than that, there's minor damage to the airplane. Well, we had one fellow that we went through training with. He was a radio man on one of the 3 crews we went over together with. He was the first death we had in our outfit. And they got shot at one night and they went down. And he was the only one on the crew who was killed. The other 7 men, the other 7, I think 2 or 3 of them were captured by the Germans right away. The other 4 evaded. They made some contact with the underground, which is very difficult. The underground has to find you and make sure you're who you think you are, because the Germans would put people in the same situation to find out who the spies were. But it ended up 3 of the guys that we trained with got all the way down to the border. They had to get out of France. They had to go to Spain. And most of this was done by walking or riding on a train or avoiding people as much as possible. A lot of the underground would help people like this, but they'd hand you off to another one and so forth. They were going over the Pyrenees Mountains to get into Spain. The one person was walking ahead of the other 2, and they were not walking together. They were acting like they weren't associated with each other. Somebody had evidently thought they were suspicious. The first guy got through. The second guy, the second 2 were captured and turned over to the Germans. The French underground, the French citizens would get paid if they turned people in like that. So they were turned in, they were prisoners of war till the war ended. One thing, I think you really get an understanding of people because you're around so many people and so many different egos and things of this nature that you learn how to listen or how not to listen or how to get mad, how not to get mad. And you build up some pretty good relationships. You really do. You have a tendency to make decisions quicker on whether you're going to like somebody or you're not going to like them. Well, and patriotism, this is something that seems to be strange now, but in our age, we grew up with it. It was just as common as bread. I mean, if you found somebody that wasn't patriotic, he was really an oddball. So with us, as we grew up, it was something natural. Just you believed in it, you lived it. But nowadays, it seems like you had a choice. Whatever's necessary. You know, you didn't have to. We had draft at that time, but there was an awful lot of people who did not go through the draft. Like myself, we enlisted. Nowadays, it seems like people that are patriotic stand out because it's something that most people don't even think about. We didn't think about it either because it's just natural. It's like getting dressed in the morning or something. You know, you don't think about it, you just do it.